In 2002, the New England Patriots faced off against the St. Louis Rams in the Super Bowl. On paper, the Rams were unstoppable. This was the type of game that you would say, let's bet the house. You bet the house on the Rams. And it was nicknamed the greatest show on turf. They had a better offense, they were more creative, and they were dangerous. But there was a man named Bill Belichick, and he had a plan. In the 2 weeks leading up to the game, his team studied the film obsessively. Not just the big plays, but even the small patterns. They studied what the Rams did on second down, how the receivers lined up, the subtle ways quarterbacks' eyes shifted, the smallest things. And even the things that were meaningless to most people, they watched carefully. Come game day in that packed stadium where you could smell the food, the popcorn, the dogs, everyone was shocked. The Rams hadn't beaten the Patriots. The Patriots beat the Rams not through strength, but through preparation. Every hit, broken route, and moment of hesitation allowed the Patriots to come out victorious. Not by overpowering them, but by understanding how they worked. There is a book that is the playbook for demons through the lens of Christianity. It is a detailed step-by-step on how demons tempt Christians. And it was written by C.S. Lewis, the same man who wrote the Chronicles of Narnia. It's called the Screwtape Letters. Through the 31 letters, Screwtape, the senior demon, encourages and helps his nephew Wormwood learn how to tempt the main human character, which is only referred to as the patient. This book was released in 1942 in the middle of World War II. And so there's a lot of themes about World War II and about war in general. In fact, there are letters strictly dedicated to mortality and death. But although this is a very serious book, and although it has a lot of serious themes, it is completely satirical. C.S. Lewis did not actually pick this batch of letters off the ground like the Death Note. He's not Light Yagami. He didn't talk to a demon and get it. In fact, after he was done writing the book, he said, though I have never written anything more easily, I never wrote with less enjoyment, because he hated writing the book. He hated having to put himself in the mindset of a demon or a tempter, as they're called in the book. Because you'll notice good is bad, bad is good. But keep in mind, the guy writing this is a demon, so if he's thinking something's good, it's probably pretty bad. I will say, and this means nothing to anyone that's watching this now, but Screwtape also wrote a sequel, and it can be found in this book too, and you can buy this book. I'll have a link in the description. It's, I think, $4. Regardless, he made a sequel that's in the very back of this book, and it's called Screwtape Proposes a Toast. Like I said, it means nothing to you now, but it is haunting. It is terrifying, the things that man says and does. It's just awful. All right, the last bit of business before we actually get into it. This book is written in order with how the patient's life goes, from him being a child to him being older, and as you'll see, he does eventually die on the 31st letter. I'm not gonna go in order with the letters because a lot of them will jump from different topics. It'll go from the topic of love to division in the church to death, back to love, back to like pride, division in the church, and it'll keep going in different order. So I've decided to group them up, but we will be jumping around a bit, and then I'll piece everything back together at the end. I think this makes more sense, and it makes everything a bit more digestible when I'm trying to explain it to you. But I do believe that is all the important context, so why don't we get started with Screwtape's first letter. The first letter, as with every one following, starts with "My dear Wormwood." And as you'll see, they all end with "Your affectionate Uncle Screwtape," except for one. There's one letter that's an exception. But the first letter starts pretty simple, and I'm gonna straight up read the first 3 sentences so you get the type of prose Screwtape uses, and I'll summarize from there. But I want you to understand kind of the language he uses. "My dear Wormwood, I note what you say about guiding your patient's reading and taking care that he sees a good deal of his materialist friends. But are you not being a trifle naive? It sounds as if you supposed that argument was the way to keep him out of the enemy's clutches. That might have been so if he had lived a few centuries earlier. At that time, the humans still knew pretty well when a thing was proved and when it was not. And if it was proved, they really believed it. Screwtape usually starts his letters talking about the last letter Wormwood had sent him. We never get to see Wormwood's letters, but we do understand what he's talking about through the opening paragraph of Screwtape's letters. Screwtape goes from that and begins to talk about how you don't need to argue with a man or do anything, in fact, that would encourage the patient to think. For who knows where that will end up, for who can see the result. In fact, Screwtape even gives him a story. Screwtape said that he used to tempt a British man who had walked into a museum, and he was beginning to teeter towards the idea of becoming Christian, of joining God and his followers. This left Screwtape anxious, but Screwtape didn't argue, didn't give him reasons why following God was incorrect or implausible, why God couldn't exist. No. Screwtape instead convinced the man that he was hungry, that it was time for lunch, and that it would be better for him to think about such important things after having a full stomach and a rested mind. This sounds logical, even from a human perspective, that, yeah, we'd want to be rested and whatever else. But the crazy thing is Screwtape even mentions, the second the man left the museum, he was already encountered by so much else. There was newspaper boys talking about the war, and it says that he had instantly been brought back to the real world, brought back to his senses, and he had left everything he had been thinking about behind in that museum. While Screwtape might not have defeated the ideas that he had been thinking of following God and that God might be real, righteous, and holy, he distracted him. And from Screwtape's perspective, if you distract a patient long enough, you still win. Screwtape then goes on to say in the same letter, if you must make a patient or a man think, have him think of ideas as not true or false, but whether they are useful or whether they're outdated. Sure, something might be false, but if it's useful, then you can let him think it. Or sure, that idea might be true. You just need to get him to acknowledge that it's an outdated idea, that society has already left that idea behind, even if it is true. Get him to base the value of an idea on whether it's useful, whether it's outdated. All right, moving on to section 2. In section 2, I have the 3rd through 6th letter, and this is all about prayer. Screwtape gives us a little bit more feedback and talks about what Wormwood had sent him. Apparently, the patient becomes a Christian. He converts. But it's also noted that he is incredibly irritated by, and I quote, his mother's daily pinpricks, her facial expressions, and typically innocent habits that just get found annoying. Screwtape spends most of the 3rd letter trying to teach and coach Wormwood through weaponizing the patient's annoyance at his mother into something more spiritually deadly, let's say. And so one of the things he says is to keep the most elementary duties away from the patient, such as being kind to your neighbor or loving people, and instead directing his attention to the most advanced spiritual tasks, studying theology and reading the Bible, the stuff that would be useless if not actually applied. Something I found shocking was he even mentions to Wormwood that it is absolutely fine for the patient to pray for her soul, as long as he's not praying for her rheumatism or anything physical. This will keep him focused on purely her sins and her spiritual state, and eventually it can be construed to where, since he's only focusing on her sins and nothing else, he's just judging her for them. And he ends up coming up with an imaginary person where, oh, she's so sinful, she needs Jesus, true. And he kind of makes a separate person in his mind. There's the person he's praying for, and then there's his actual mother, and that has physical problems as well. And Screwtape says, given even more time, no thought or feeling that he has during his prayers about his mother will flow into his treatment of her. Meaning that he's sitting there praying for her soul, praying for her spiritual prosperity. But then the second he unfolds his arms and stops bowing, he goes out and starts being an absolute tyrant telling her how she's awful and whatever else he would be doing to his mother in 1930 something. I don't know. I will say one of the things I appreciate most about the prayer aspect is this next part. Screwtape basically says, instead of looking toward God, have them look towards themselves. And you might first think, oh, he's talking about like making themselves their own God, but not quite. Instead, what he's really saying, and he continues up with another couple sentences, he says, instead of allowing them to truly ask for courage or to truly ask for forgiveness, instead have them seek to feel courageous and to feel forgiven. We're going to see a lot of that in future letters with feeling things instead of actually doing things. Screwtape basically says to teach the man to estimate the value of his prayer based on how he feels afterwards. If he feels great afterwards, after a prayer, that was a great prayer. But if he just feels a little disconnected, he was tired and now he doesn't feel like it was a good prayer, then that was a bad prayer. Something's wrong, maybe spiritually. Maybe God doesn't like him anymore. Maybe he's done something wrong. I don't know, man, or maybe you were just tired. But it's so real. It's so real. We can then tell through one of the letters that Wormwood is super excited. The war has officially kicked off. We are now in World War II. And Wormwood is ecstatic. He's seeing the death, he's seeing the pain and the suffering. But Screwtape says, hey, you gotta reel that back in. Because war can be useful, but it ruins one of our best weapons. And then he goes to explain what that weapon was, and it's uncontented worldliness. It's easier to be content with the world when everything is going well. But it's pretty difficult to be content with the world or to look for a shiny house or a better car when everything's getting blown up. One of the reoccurring themes that we're going to see a lot throughout a lot of these letters is the concept of war, how it interacts with spirituality, because this was written during World War II. And another one we're going to see a lot is the concept of consuming or devouring other entities, whether that be spiritual entities, whether that be people. Screwtape talks about like eating humans. And one of the things that Screwtape says, even in one of the earlier letters, is that should Wormwood do his job well, and should Wormwood be able to make his patient fall into despair, he will, and I quote, have the patient as a brimful chalice of despair, horror, and astonishment, to which he may raise his lips to as often as he please. And now for the last letter in the prayer section. We learn that the patient's age and profession make him eligible to be called for military service. He is going to war. Screwtape tells Wormwood a little bit about how God wants his followers to focus on their actions and not the events surrounding them. Focus on what you can do and not what you can't do. And why should one infantryman in the war, in the trenches, be focusing on the entirety of the war and all of the politics? They can't, there's no point in stressing about that. Screwtape mentions that he should help the patient think of his trials as nothing more or less than what he's frightened of. If you've ever seen an episode of like Fear Factor or any of like the courageous challenges on YouTube where people are surrounded by spiders, Wormwood would have you think that in its most true form is simply what you are afraid of. Meanwhile, God and the Christian ethics would have you think of that as your cross, the cross that you're going to carry that day, and potentially even to your death. The final part about prayer that he writes in this sixth letter is that he wants the patient to be distracted from realizing that he is entering a lustful or an angry state of mind. This is something that I believe As a Man Thinketh talks a lot about, thinking about what you're thinking about. So when you have a thought, what As a Man Thinketh and what even God would tell you to do in this book would be to have the thought and then think, why did I think that? Like, why? And what Screwtape is saying is they have the thought, they're angry, right? Don't let them have this thing. Don't let them think about why they're angry. Don't let them even recognize that they're angry. Leave the thought right there. Just right there. However, what Screwtape does want is if their thought is charitable, or if their thought is devout, if it's a righteous thought. Then he wants them to think about the thought, because then it's a self-conscious like righteousness, and they can be like, wow, I was so charitable today. Wow, I really did a good thing there. Yeah, I'm awesome. And usually you're not going to end it with I'm awesome, but he gets the point across. Overall, he ends the letter with keep hate close and charity far. The tempters don't mind if you're charitable to people across the world, if you're hateful to those close to you. If you are hateful to your family, your friends, and your coworkers, what does it matter if you send money to Ghana to help feed them? It does matter. I'm not saying don't send money to Ghana. I'm just saying, according to the book, and I agree, you can't just be good to people that you'll never see and be awful to everyone else in your life. But moving on from that, we're talking about worldliness. Section 3, the 7th through 13th letter, and then the 28th letter at the very end of the book. This is the longest chapter, and also one of the ones I think is the most entertaining. Though I will say my favorite is the one on love that's coming up. I'm a sucker for that stuff. I'm gonna start chapter 7 the same way Screwtape did and just read off what he wrote. My dear Wormwood, I wonder, you should ask me whether it is essential to keep the patient in ignorance of your own existence. That question, at least, for the present phase of the struggle, has been answered by the High Command. Our policy for the moment is to conceal ourselves. Of course, this has not always been so. We really are faced with a huge, cruel dilemma. Wormwood was clearly asking in his letter whether or not he should conceal himself from the patient. And this is Screwtape's response. The High Command, he'll refer to it as the lowerarchy in the future, basically said, hey, keep quiet. It hasn't always been so, but keep quiet. He ends up talking about the pros and cons of this, one of which is they cannot experience the pleasure of direct torment, which, cool. They are also incapable of typically making magicians like they would have 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago. They can't make magi because if people are out casting fireball, then I think we'll kind of have an idea what's going on. I'd like to think. He sums it up as, when demons are visible, it becomes impossible or incredibly difficult to make materialists and skeptics out of the patients. Which is fair. Screwtape now kind of rattles off a couple like one-off sentences that I think are pretty cool. He says that all extremes are to be encouraged except for an extreme devotion to God. This is especially true in our time, especially so in politics. And you're supposed to believe politically in one extreme or the other. The middle doesn't exist. Both sides can't be right. Both sides can't have any good ideas. Your side is the only correct side, is basically the thought Screwtape wants the patients to think. Now, the lowerarchy world building expands again. We learn of another demon called Slubgob. Screwtape says, my dear Wormwood, so you have great hopes that the patient's religious phase is dying away, have you? I always thought the training college has gone to pieces since they put old Slubgob at the head of it. I am now sure. Has no one ever told you about the law of undulation? He spends so much time talking about the law of undulation. So much time. The law of undulation, as far as Screwtape is concerned, and thus by proxy kind of C.S. Lewis, is that the human spirit will naturally enter seasons of dryness as we are changing creatures. That makes sense. And this kind of goes back to the idea of feeling. If you feel your prayer was ineffective, then you would want the patient to think it was, even though that's not true. And Screwtape says that this can be a great or an awful thing. It is basically raw material for the tempters to mold, as if they feel dry and they are convinced that's because they have done something wrong, sometimes they can fall away. However, and he says, do not be deceived, Wormwood. Our cause is never in more danger than when a human, no longer desiring, but still intending to do the enemy's will, looks round upon the universe, sees every trace of him vanished, asks why he has been forsaken, and still obeys his will. Sees every traces of him vanished, asks why he has been forsaken, and still obeys. That, according to Screwtape, that is the most dangerous thing for the tempters when they are in a spiritual season of dryness and they still obey. Moving on to the next letter. He starts the letter by saying that he hopes his last letter convinced him that just because his patient is going through a spiritual season of dryness does not mean that the tempters will properly be able to exploit his soul. He now talks about what type of exploitation to use to get his soul. This entire letter can be summarized by basically saying that pleasure is God's invention, but demons or the tempters will use pleasure as God's invention in ways God doesn't allow. In other words, nothing is wrong with sharing a drink with friends, but once you get the patient to run to alcohol as his God, then something is wrong. Or nothing is wrong with having sex with your wife, but then you do it outside of marriage, and that is forbidden, and that is a sin. The only other thing he really talks about in this letter is that he shouldn't let the patient suspect the law of undulation, because once the patient knows that his spirit will sometimes be dry and sometimes be very fruitful, then he'll know, and it kind of takes away the monster. He says as long as the patient doesn't know of the law of undulation, he should be allowed to think that the fervor he felt for the Lord at the start of his journey as a Christian should be permanent. Then when he also feels his dryness, he should think that is permanent. It's pretty cool. He says that once his spirit is dry and once he believes that it's permanent, he will go back and he'll start doubting his initial stages of Christianity, thinking that maybe he was just being a bit ridiculous, maybe he went a little too far, and maybe that Christianity is good still, but in moderation. Which that is a trap, an absolute trap. We get to learn about another tempter named Triptwise, and Triptwise tells Screwtape that the patient has made some new friends that happen to be communists, rich communists specifically. Is that right? Yeah, they're rich communists. Screwtape also says and provides some instructions to Wormwood. He says that the patient will be unaware that the pleasure he has around his friends is also a temptation, and that while modern Christians are aware of the dangers of mammon or money, and while they're aware of the dangers of like lust and power and fame, a lot of them aren't aware of the temptation of just being around bad people, being around people that are actively pulling you away from the faith. And he says that since humans become what they pretend, like the saying, you become the 5 people you spend the most time with, since humans become what they pretend, just delaying the patient's realization that he shouldn't be around them may make him take some of their traits when he leaves their side. Screwtape says that Wormwood should let him realize that they are incompatible only when he is away from them. When he's with them, he's having a great time, it's a pleasurable time. And then when he goes away and he's with another group of friends, then he's like, wow, maybe that's not great. And then when he's back with them, he's having a great time. And it's a whole thing. It's a whole thing. Human relationships suck. He says he may even take pleasure. And I think this is a bar. He may even take pleasure in the fact that he lives 2 opposing lives. He will be prideful because he understands the hedonism and the real world when he is with his Christian friends. And when he is with his non-Christian friends, he will feel prideful because he understands the spiritual world on a deeper level than all of them. And so it's a trick to making him feel prideful in both situations. C.S. Lewis was cooking when he wrote this book. Screwtape then starts talking about laughter and the different types of laughter. He classifies them as joy, fun, joke proper, and flippancy. He says that joy is the type of laughter you have when you see lovers or your family after a long time on a holiday or a reunion, and that joy is righteous. He then says that fun is like the animalistic froth of joy. It's more emotional than spiritual, it's more short-term and short-lived. That is a raw material that can be used for either good or bad, but it's not just bad. He then talks about joke proper, and he says that even 1,000 bawdy or blasphemous jokes don't move a man one step either way. But if they can learn to twist their wicked actions into a joke, making it socially forgivable, then there is value. Doing something awful and then just turning it into some sort of joke and now it's okay. There was a trend where for throwing hot honey buns. Yeah, throwing a hot honey bun at a homeless man is awful. It's just awful. But then you turn it into a trend and you make it a joke, and now we're throwing hot honey buns at homeless people. I would say that's pretty valuable for the tempters. The last type of laughter that he talks about is flippancy. Rage baiting or flippancy, it just deadens your intellect. And he even says it. Screwtape says it, not me. I've been telling my friends this the whole time, for like years. But it deadens intellect. And it doesn't even bring about much affection in the ones that practice it. Even the people that practice it, they don't feel like they've made some great joke days down the line. Then they just have to keep doing it. And so it's a never-ending loop. Rage baiting is so stupid. Screwtape starts another letter, and he is very happy to hear when Wormwood tells him that the patient is still a believer, but he's more so wearing the exoskeleton of a believer. He's lukewarm. He's doing the things he's supposed to do on the outside, but he's not really practicing anything on the inside. And Screwtape responds saying that this is much better, much more valuable than him being shocked into realizing that he's been caught into a trap. He says, the safest road to hell is a gradual one with gentle slope, soft underfoot, without sudden turnings, without milestones, and without signposts. It reminds me of the story of the boiling crab. If you put a crab into a pot and you turn the pot up super, super high temperature, the crab is going to jump out because he realizes he's being boiled. However, if you put a crab into a pot and you turn it up a degree every couple of minutes, every half hour, eventually the crab, since he's comparing the temperature to what was 5 minutes ago, he's not going to jump out and he will just be boiled alive. We then go on to letter 13, which is the last in the big section, and then we're going to have the 28th letter. But Screwtape is furious. Screwtape, he's mad. At the start of the 13th letter, we'd learn that Wormwood allowed, maybe allowed is a bad word, but we learned that the patient had what is to be considered as a second conversion, greater than his first. And Screwtape very much so alludes to a punishment that Wormwood will eventually have to face, or allowing this to happen. Screwtape then begins to explain some of the parts where Wormwood went wrong. He explains real versus fake pleasure. An example of this is he allowed the patient to have real pleasure in just reading a book or going on a walk, admiring beauty, admiring creativity. And this is a problem because it detaches him from the fake pleasure that Wormwood was feeding him, the pleasure of stealing, of lust, of whatever else. Screwtape is quoted as saying, as a preliminary to detaching him from the enemy, you must first detach the patient from himself, from his personality. And while people might say that to be a Christian, you have to give up yourself, give up your personality, that's the language that's used. It's more so a loss of self-will, not personality. God gave us personality for a reason, and even Screwtape says that when we give up our self-will, God gives us even more back. He continues by going on kind of like a tirade. He starts ranting about how he loves to make his patients give up what they enjoy for the best. An example is giving up your favorite food for the best food, or giving up your favorite TV show for the best TV show, the most popular TV show, because it helps strip people of their personality and makes everyone one big mess. We are now in the 28th letter out of 31. 28th letter. 31. We are very far from the 13th letter. There's a lot in the middle, and we're gonna get there, I promise. But we are on the 28th letter out of 31. The war is raging. The patient has been drafted, and Screwtape tells Wormwood that if the patient dies tonight, they will surely lose his soul. They will surely lose it. Screwtape says that the war increases conscious dependence on God. When you're seeing what you think is real be torn apart, and when you're seeing all of the despair, you realize that there has to be something out there. And could that be naive? Yes, but also it awakens you to what? you might have thought was real the entire time. Screwtape says that one of the reasons that war wakes people up is because as people are in comfort and safety, as they become prosperous, they get knitted to the world. In fact, his exact quote is that prosperity knits a man to the world. He feels that he is finding his place in it, when really, the world is finding its place in him. Section 4, which is based on humility, only has 3 letters in comparison to the last section having 8. So this is a bit of a faster section, but I will say this is one of the ones that I like more. This along with section 6, which is love, and section 8, which is death. Screwtape starts this section by saying that one of the most alarming things he's heard recently about the patient is that he is no longer making any confident resolutions, which marked his original conversion. He's no longer making any lavish promises of perpetual virtue. He's no longer expecting any sort of endowment of grace for his entire life, but instead only a hope for daily and hourly penitence as he meets his hourly temptations. Screwtape says, and I quote, "This is very bad." Screwtape says that all virtues are less formidable when the patient realizes that he has them. He then expresses comedic level of fear that the patient should be aware of his trick if it's overused. Like, he is terrified that this patient's gonna learn. So he's telling Wormwood, do not overuse this trick. This one simple trick that'll get whatever you want. Don't overuse it. He then ends with one of the greatest things I've ever heard. Humility is not demeaning yourself. It is accurately knowing where you stand. God, and this is a quote, God, or he, would rather the man think himself a great architect or a great poet, and then forget about it, than that he should spend much time and pains trying to think himself a bad one. Humility is just knowing where you stand. And I believe that's in 1 Corinthians as well, that humility is knowing where you stand in the world. It's not having a huge ego about it, and it's not thinking that you're bad about it. It's just realistically knowing where you stand in the world. Screwtape then responds to another one of Wormwood's letters and asks why the patient only attends one church, even though he's not wholly pleased with it. He says that indifference is the only reason a man should attend one church. Keep in mind, this is the tempter saying it, so reverse that. It's good he's at one church. I think we're on the same page. It's bad to go to every other church. Okay. Screwtape wants to make the patient a connoisseur of multiple churches. And I will say, C.S. Lewis kind of shines through when he's talking about church division, especially when he does it through Screwtape. Because when people get caught up between the terms of Mass and Holy Communion and church and whatever, just the different denominations in general, Screwtape finds that hilarious. He makes it very clear how funny he finds that. So y'all are in for a treat. Letter 21, which is the final letter of the humility section. I straight up said that I wanted to read, at least mostly, just directly to the camera, because there's so much I'd miss trying to just summarize. So I figured I'd just read it. My dear Wormwood, yes, a period of sexual temptation is an excellent time for working in a subordinate attack on the patient's peevishness. It may even be the main attack, as long as he thinks it is the subordinate one. But here, as in everything else, the way must be prepared for your moral assault by darkening his intellect. Men are not angered by mere misfortune, but by misfortune conceived as injury. And the sense of injury depends on the feeling that a legitimate claim has been denied. The more claims he has on life, therefore, that your patient can be induced to make, the more often he will feel injured, and as a result, ill-tempered. Now you will have noticed that nothing throws him into a passion so easily as to find a track of time which he reckoned on having at his own disposal unexpectedly taken from him. It is the unexpected visitor, or the friend's talkative wife, that throws him out of gear. He does go on for another 2 or 3 pages, but he says that a man can neither make nor give any moment of his time to anything. It is God that gives us our time, and that when someone else takes it from us, or when we lose time to something, we're not losing anything of our own, as we are all living on borrowed time. It is God's time that is being given to these things, and God may spend it as he pleases, So he says it is foolishness to be thrown out of gear over losing time that was never theirs to begin with. Screwtape also says, don't try to defend this argument. Don't let him even think of it. Because if you try defending it, and he said this kind of earlier, if you tried defending or arguing for the fact that this is his time, you're going to lose that fight, because there is no, and Screwtape says, no reasonable way to defend that. So instead he says, wrap a dark shroud around it. Don't let the patient even think. Don't let the thoughts come to his mind that the time is God's and not his, and that he is living through borrowed time. And finally, he talks about the concept of possessing God. He says that when we're talking about things in a daily life, the patient will say that this is my marker, this is my cup, and he will use it in the exact same sense as if he was saying my teddy bear. And when someone says my teddy bear, or a child says my teddy bear, they're saying it in the sense that it is the teddy bear which they can tear apart if they so please. No one else will mind, and if they do mind, they have no right to. We use that sense of my and possessiveness in the same way that we do when we say my God. And he says a lot of patients will use this, and they will treat God as the God on whom I have my claim distinguished, services, and on whom I exploit from the pulpit, the God I have done a corner in. Which I think is an interesting point. I mean, it's true that there aren't a whole bunch of words in the English language that we can use instead, but the idea is still very fascinating to me. He says that the only person in existence that can use the word mine as actual possessivity is God. After a quick wardrobe change, we're on to section 5, which I have titled The Past, Future, and the Miscellaneous. At the start of the 15th letter, Screwtape writes, "My dear Wormwood, I had noticed, of course, that the humans are having a lull in their European war, what they naively call the war. I am not surprised that there is a corresponding lull in the patient's anxieties. Do we want to encourage this, or keep him worried? Tortured fear and stupid confidence are both desirable states of mind. Our choice between them raises important questions. The humans live in time, but our enemy destines them to eternity. He, therefore, I believe, wants them to attend chiefly to two things: to eternity itself, and to that point of time which they call the present." C.S. Lewis specifically will talk about this a bit more, but he mentions that the only connection that we have to eternity is the present. It's not the future, and it's not the past. The only way that we can impact eternity is through the present. This section of the book, these 3 letters that we're going to cover, are definitely the most confusing, but I'll try to make it digestible. Screwtape says that only the present and not the future nor the past matter. The future and the past don't matter, and he ends up saying that it is only the present in which free will exists, that it is the tempter's job to get the patients to narrow their focus on the past or the future. It doesn't matter as long as it's not the present. Screwtape then amends his statement later on in his letter, saying that gratitude can be found in the past, so there is some value in the past. And he says in the future, the only thing that can be found is fear, avarice, lust, and ambition. So the future is still worthless to any extent that planning is not necessary, and the past is useless to any extent that gratitude can't be found. Screwtape is quoted as saying that he wants a whole race perpetually in pursuit of the rainbow's end, never honest, nor kind, nor happy now, but always using mere fuel wherewith to heap the altar of the future every real gift what is offered to them in the present. It is then the 17th letter, one of my favorites, that Screwtape talks about gluttony, and it's a pretty fun topic the way he discusses it. He mentions that in contemporary times, which at this point was 1942, people don't have so much a gluttony of excess, as in so many things. It is instead a gluttony of quality. And he shares a story of a woman, and this woman goes to a restaurant, and in this restaurant she orders a salad, a normal salad. She gets the salad from the wait staff, and she sends it back saying that she could never eat that much salad. And she's thinking to herself that she is combating gluttony by consuming less, by not overindulging. But really, Screwtape says that by trying to combat gluttony, she is being an absolute terror to the wait staff and an absolute terror to everyone around her, when she could simply have taken it to go. She could have simply given it to someone else. There were many other options, but instead, to try and seem like she was not gluttonous, she ended up being an absolute terror to all of the waitstaff. Screwtape then talks about different sins like lust and stealing, and how if the patient ever falls into these sins, that Wormwood should make the patient think about what spiritual pitfall he had fallen into previously, whether he has pride or just a lack of faith, and he should make the patient completely neglect that there could be any physical aspect. Screwtape says that a simple analysis of what the patient has eaten and drank and how he slept in the last 24 hours will provide a lot of information on reasons why he may have committed some sin. He finishes off the 17th letter by saying that a lot of people, and I agree, especially now in the 2020s, are so consumed with the idea that physical exercise in excess is going to like beat away temptation. He says absolutely not. If anything, that gets you more weary and more susceptible. And I think the key word there is in excess. It's not physical exercise. That's great. Even the Bible says that it is of some worth. Screwtape is saying in excess. Now we're going to jump from the 17th letter to the 27th letter. If you remember the 28th letter, he got drafted into war. So we are right before the patient gets drafted into the war. You'll notice that I'm going to start mentioning a love interest in this letter. Don't worry, that's the very next thing we're going to talk about. Screwtape starts his letter saying, "My dear Wormwood, you seem to be doing very little good at present. The use of his love to distract the mind from the enemy is, of course, obvious, but you reveal what poor use you are making of it. When you say the whole question of distraction and the wandering mind has now become the chief subject of his prayers, this means you have largely failed. When this or any other distraction crosses his mind, you ought to encourage him to thrust it away by sheer willpower and try to continue normal prayer as if nothing has happened." He even brings up a pretty good point about what he calls the heads I win, tails you lose argument. You might be wondering what you're looking at. This is my version of the heads I win, tails you lose argument. The patient prays. If it does happen, if his prayer comes true, it is simply a coincidence and God had nothing to do with it. If it doesn't come true, then that means that God is not real / God doesn't listen. My handwriting is terrible, but this is the best diagram I could come up with, so you're going to have to deal with it. I'm sorry. I mentioned this was the most confusing section, and the 27th letter takes that even further. "You," says Screwtape, "being a spirit, will find it difficult to understand how he gets into this confusion," referring to the heads I win, tails you lose argument. "But you must remember that he takes time for an ultimate reality. He supposes that the enemy, God, like himself, sees some things as present, remembers others as past, and anticipates others as future. Or even if he believes that the enemy does not see things that way, yet in his heart of hearts, he regards this as a peculiarity of the enemy's mode of perception. He doesn't really think, though he would say he did, that things as the enemy sees them are things as they are. Point blank, period." There's been a big question recently regarding prayer and whether God is either answering them or whether he's already decided to answer them. And people bring up Moses praying to God to like quell his anger. And he's like, well, God changed his mind, blah, blah, blah. And it's confusing. It really is, because yeah, God does listen to prayers, and no, God doesn't change. And I think one of the things that this book answers so well is this question, because we see things as humans as past, present, and future. In the present, I'm praying. In the future, God will do this differently than what I thought he was going to do in the past. I hope you're following. But in reality, God doesn't see things as the past, present, and future. He's not stuck in the flow of time. He is at all time, at the same time. And it's impossible to fully understand. But he's not bound by our limit of, so I pray for this now, so he might do in the future. And on a slightly more digestible note, Screwtape argues that it is impossible just strictly impossible, to deceive the entire human race. So the next best thing that Wormwood and other tempters ought to accomplish is to disconnect the knowledge from one generation to the other, that we may not learn from our fathers and they may not learn from theirs. And now we are on to section 6. Love. This is easily my favorite section. I love books about love. The Art of Loving by Erich Fromm is one of the greatest books I've ever read, and so I was very excited to see these kind of letters and this kind of content in the Screwtape Letters. The letters we're going to talk about in this section is 18, 19, 20, 22, and 26. Starting with 18, Screwtape begins with summarizing the boundaries of sexual love as commanded by God. The options for humans being either total abstinence or unmitigated monogamy. Either totally abstain or you can be with one person. He says that total abstinence has been nearly impossible since the Garden of Eden, which reminded me of the scene from Milton's Paradise Lost where Adam says he would rather fall with Eve and be with her. So, true. In fact, Milton even gets a shout out in one of these letters. I don't remember which one, but he gets a shout out in one of these letters. He also says that the demons and tempters have pushed love in recent centuries to be more reliant on a spark, and very obviously they fade just as fast. They say that any marriage should make that spark permanent, and the lack of permanence is a reason to void marriage, which is obviously not biblical and not true in general. Even non-Christians would say that that's very clearly not true, or at the very least they would say it's not beneficial. And this is where the letter gets fun. I mentioned that we would talk a lot about devouring and demons devouring humans, humans devouring other humans, the strong devouring the weak. And he actually talks a lot about this in the concept of love. And the first place we see it is where he talks about the axiom of hell. This is the general truth of hell. And that truth is that one thing is not another. My good cannot be yours, and when one gains something, another loses. He says that this applies to objects. As one object expands, it pushes other things away from itself. And when it shrinks, others will absorb that space. Screwtape actually ends this little section with a fire quote, which is, to be in competition. To exist is to exist to compete. And then in contrast to this, Screwtape says that the truth of heaven, and there's big quotations because he doesn't believe this. He says the truth of heaven is that the good of oneself is the good of another. And then here Screwtape complains, and he complains a lot. He spends about half of this letter just complaining about how the Trinity isn't possible, about how the Trinity doesn't make any sense. And then he starts complaining about how human reproduction is one of the only examples of my good being your good that he could ever think of. He says that God could just as easily have made human reproduction like that of spiders, where the strong, the female, devours the weak after the reproductive cycle. After Screwtape's very long rant, you have to read it. It's beautiful, it really is. But after Screwtape's very long rant, he talks about how God describes married couples as one flesh, not one happy flesh. He even laughs at patients for being so silly that they would think that God's marriage and its benefits are less important than, as he describes, the storm of emotion that the West calls love. I hope you're seeing why these are some of my favorite letters. Screwtape then starts his next letter saying, oopsie, I committed a heresy, and I know, you know what, hold on. So Screwtape commits a heresy by saying that God truly wants what's best for the patient, which they are not allowed to say in what they call the lowerarchy, because it implies that God is actually holy and righteous, and thus loving of the patients. This heresy is so because he says that all selves are by nature in competition, and that can't be true if God truly loves the patients, and that especially can't be true if God's three selves are not in competition. Screwtape is convinced that it is impossible that love can exist, even with God, and he spends 2.5 out of the 3 pages of this letter ranting about trying to figure out what God is really up to, what he is really doing everything for, and what his true endgame is, because it is not love, apparently. And then he then reiterates what I've been saying the whole time, whereas most things, including love, are just raw molds that are just raw material that both armies are trying to mold into something that's useful for them. We now jump to letter 22, which might just be my favorite letter. We learn at the very start that, I'm just gonna read. My dear Wormwood, so your man is in love, and with the worst kind he could have possibly fallen into. With a girl who does not even appear in the report you send me. You may be interested to learn that the little misunderstanding with the secret police, which you tried to raise about some unguarded expressions in one of my letters, has been tided over. If you are reckoning on that to secure my good offices, you will find yourself mistaken. You shall pay for that as well as your other blunders. Meanwhile, I enclosed a little booklet, just issued, on the new House of Correction for incompetent tempters. It is profusely illustrated, and you will not find a dull page within it. Dude, dude, I'm ready for the Screwtape rap battle. So it's obvious that Wormwood, from the 19th letter to the 22nd letter, reported Screwtape for that heresy that Screwtape himself admitted. And he was likely trying to secure his office and get his fancy little promotion, which Screwtape, and I just love the drama because this really has nothing to do with anything, but I love the drama. Screwtape somehow tidies it over. He somehow gets everything to be all sorted and mentions to Wormwood that he will have to pay for that later on. Even better is he sends a booklet from the House of Correction for incompetent tempters to Wormwood. This is fantastic.
Quite frankly, I find that to be the spiritual version of the Kendrick Drake rap battle. I am waiting for the Wormwood Screwtape diss track to drop. That's what I've been waiting for. That's why I'm at a new location, actually. I was hoping it would drop before the video came out. Doesn't look like it. Regardless, to get back to when he's talking about the patient's love interest, he calls her a two-faced little cheat. He says he knows the sort, who looks as if she would faint at the sight of blood, but then dies with a smile. A cheat in every way. Looks as if butter wouldn't melt her in the mouth and yet has satirical wit. The sort of creature who would find me funny in all caps. Heck yeah, that's a W for her. He calls her a filthy, insipid little prude. He then continues making fun of the enemy or God. He goes on to talk about noise and how the tempters are trying to create as much noise as possible to distract the patients. Kind of like the fan in my background that it's so loud. Regardless, as he's talking about that and how the scientists in the lower hierarchy are trying to create as much noise as possible, he says, and I quote, "In the heat of composition, I find that I have inadvertently allowed myself to assume the form of a large centipede. I am accordingly dictating the rest to my secretary. Now that the transformation is complete, I recognize it as a periodical phenomenon. Some rumor of it has reached the humans, and a distorted account of it appears in the poet Milton, with the ridiculous addition that such changes of shape are a punishment imposed upon us by the enemy." I told you the Milton shout-out was coming. I don't lie. Now for the 26th letter, the last in the love section. Screwtape begins to talk about patients that are in courtship in the courtship period or dating, and how they delay problems under the guise of love, the guise of selflessness, and they don't realize that those problems that they're delaying are going to resurface. Basically, don't base the degree of charity you have with your partner off of the enchantment you feel at the start of the relationship, because it won't last. He ends with a quote saying that a little real selfishness is less valuable for securing the patient's soul than some sort of elaborate self-conscious unselfishness. He gives an example in the form of a game called the generous conflict illusion, and the example is at a tea party. You have a family trying to plan a tea party, and one person says, "Well, I don't like tea personally, but because I like you guys and I want you guys to have a good time, let's do the tea party." So everyone else trying to accommodate will say, "Oh, we don't have to do a tea party. We can go here, we can do that." The original person is going to say, no, seriously, we'll do the tea party. That's fine. I just won't drink any tea." And this continues until everyone is upset and nobody wants tea. Welcome to the generous conflict illusion. Chapter 7 is about church division, and this is one of the topics in which C.S. Lewis shines the most. This encompasses letters 2 and 23 to 25. It is in letter 2 that we find out that the patient becomes a Christian. We learn that there is another punishment that will be meted out to Wormwood for his failure, and I felt like I have to include this. This is also the point that my bullet points stopped referring to Wormwood and Screwtape in their full name. It just now says ST or WW. So when I see it, I think of Walter White or Woodrow Wilson. It's Screwtape says that Wormwood should be making the patient think of the church as the half-constructed Gothic building on the street corner instead of as the collection of history spanning thousands of years. He should feel disconnected from the leaders of the faith and the founders of the faith. He should feel disconnected from the apostles or perhaps the popes. He should not notice the full body of Christ, but instead that his neighbor singing next to him is out of tune, or that a few seats down someone has squeaky boots. In letter 23, we have a fire quote. If the flesh and the world fail to corrupt, says Screwtape, make the patient a spoiled saint or Pharisee. Screwtape then begins to talk about the historical Jesus and how each iteration of the historical Jesus changes by magnifying some aspects and shrinking others. For example, you may magnify the story of feeding the 500 and shrink the importance of him saying to give to Caesar what is Caesar's when it comes to paying taxes. Screwtape says that each iteration pushes a completely new agenda, which I find interesting because if the documents haven't changed in 2,000 years, why does the historical Jesus change every 30? Just saying, just saying. So like women in general are about to catch a stray, so sorry about that. Screwtape says that women, especially those raised in the church, have an idea of Christianity being the right faith in the same sense as the knives that their father used as a kid being the right knives or the proper knives. This is a false pride that she's absorbed from her surroundings, and he would like Wormwood to get the patient to imitate this defect. He says that although this false pride isn't super detrimental to the woman, what is venial in her can become one of the patient's strongest vices. Screwtape then moves on to a completely new topic in which I have drawn Elijah's religious contrast chart. Screwtape says that Wormwood should create a contrast between the circle of believers and a circle of non-believers. And he should make Wormwood believe that he is enchanted by the believers and bored by the non-believers. And the way this works is because his love interest, which is right here in my beautiful handwriting, is a believer and her family were believers, and they probably have some friends that are believers, he will feel enchanted, because he's with his boo thing, that when he goes to the non-believers, this side, and he's no longer with his love interest, he will mistake her absence for their lack of spirituality and think, oh wow, non-believers are just boring and I don't want to hang out with these people because they're boring. I explained that like you're a child, but don't take offense because I'm sure there's at least one child that will watch this at some point. So I'm doing it for them. On the same track, but now on letter 25, we talk about how the patient is merely Christian, which is a problem because he should be Christian and something else. Christian and conservative, Christian and liberal, Christian and humanitarian, Christian and vegan, Christian and whatever. The more lines and additions added to the Christian identity will cause more division and separation in the broader church. Because instead of Christians being able to rally around fellow Christians, now it's a Christian conservative rallying around Christian conservatives. Or now it's a liberal Christian vegan rallying around other liberal Christian vegans. The more specific and niche you get it, the less support they have and the less power they have as a group. One of the things that the Screwtape Letters did so beautifully was talk about the fear of the same old thing. Ever since I was a kid, the one consistent thing I've prayed for is to have a exciting, chaotic, and uncertain life. And Screwtape talks about the idea of fearing the same old thing. He says it's foolish because God gives the proper amount of change. He says that the seasons forever change, but within their unchanging boundaries. He says we have a love of change balanced with the love of permanence. Now, as society, we have altered the word unchanged to now mean the word stagnant. We have added the negative connotation to it. And as we get closer to the patient's death I foreshadowed, we're going to talk about death in the 29th through 31st letters. Screwtape mentions that the research department in the lowerarchy has yet to produce any way of generating virtue, which sounds weird, but he says any great wickedness requires some virtue. He uses Attila the Hun as an example, saying what would they have been if they had no bravery, or what would Hitler have been if he had no charisma. He then goes further and says, let patients convince themselves that they feel hatred on behalf of others as a virtue. In the context of World War II, this may be some Allied soldier in the trenches seeing all the awful things going on around them and then hating the Germans for what they've done to the kids. He's hating the Germans for the kids, those that have died, when really that's no closer to a virtue than just admitting that he hates them himself. If anything, admitting he hates them for his own reasons is more honest. We get more complaining tape, and he says that if the tempters promote goodness, God wins, and if they promote evil, then war breaks out and incentivizes patients to look towards God, and God wins. Complaining tape sees this as an unfair lose-lose. Sorry, buddy. He says that there's pretty much nothing the patient can do that's an instant capture of his soul, but what one would can do is aggravate the shame of his sins into despair and make him think that he cannot be forgiven. Screwtape then says, and once again in the context of World War II, that fear is of no use to them. The act of cowardice is all Screwtape desires, which I think the important word in that is the act of cowardice. Fear is all in your mind. You were not born with the spirit of fear, but it is all in your mind. It is the act of not doing something because you are afraid. That is what Screwtape desires. Upset Tape then writes and says that the war is continuing to rage. He yells at Wormwood and says that all he has been able to do is get the patient angered by a dog that tripped him, alongside some excessive cigarette smoking and the forgetting of a single prayer. So some pretty terrible stuff. Hungry Tape warns Wormwood that he better bring us back food, or he shall become food himself, and just remember that and stay with me, remember that. I then left a note for myself saying to directly read page 166. So that's what I would do. To produce the best results from the patient's fatigue, said Screwtape, therefore you must feed him with false hopes. Put into his mind plausible reasons for believing that the air raid will not be repeated. Keep him comforting himself with the thought of how much he will enjoy his bed next night. Exaggerate the weariness by making him think it will soon be over. For men usually feel that a strain could have been endured no longer than at the very moment when it is ending, or when they think it is ending. In this, as in the problem of cowardice, the thing to avoid is the total commitment. Whatever he says, let his inner resolution be not to bear whatever comes to him, but to bear it for a reasonable period, and let the reasonable period be shorter than the trial is likely to last. It need not be much shorter. In attacks on patience, chastity, and fortitude, the fun is to make the man yield just when, had he but known it, relief was almost in sight. The 30th letter is concluded with Screwtape saying that one of the greatest victories that the tempters have had is making pain real and joy fake, in the sense that it's subjective. He gives the example of childbirth. The pain and the blood of childbirth are real. They are real pains. And yet the rejoicing of having the child, of safely getting through it, that is subjective. The hatred you feel for a coworker is real, but the love you feel for a friend is subjective. Another example is that war and poverty are really terrible. However, peace and plenty are subjective. The only real way to do this letter complete justice would be to read it directly. I will read some parts of it, but I do truly believe you should either look up a PDF of this book or buy it yourself. It's $4 on Amazon. Do me a favor and just read the 31st letter. I will read some parts of it, and in fact, we start with the introduction. Unlike in most other letters, he does not refer to Wormwood as my dear Wormwood, but instead, my dear, my very dear Wormwood, my poppet, my pigsney. How mistakenly, now that all is lost, you come whimpering to ask me whether the terms of affection in which I address you meant nothing from the beginning. Far from it. Rest assured, my love for you and your love for me are as like two peas. I have always desired you, as you, pitiful fool, desired me. The difference is that I am the stronger. I think they will give you to me now, or a bit of you. Love you? Why, yes, as dainty a morsel as ever I grew fat on. You have let a soul slip through your fingers. How well I know what happened at the instant when they snatched him from you. There was a sudden clearing of his eyes, was there not, as he saw you for the first time and recognized the part you had in him, and he knew that you had it no longer. Just think, and let it be the beginning of your agony. What he felt at that moment, as if a scab had fallen from an old sore, as if he was emerging from a hideous, shell-like tetter, as if he shuttled off for good, and all a defiled, wet, clinging garment. The more one thinks about it, the worse it becomes. He got through so easily. No gradual misgivings, no doctor's sentence, no nursing home, no operating theater, no false hopes of life. Sheer, instantaneous liberation. One moment it seemed to be all our world. The scream of bombs, the fall of houses, the stinking taste of high explosive on the lips and in the lungs, the feet burning with weariness, the heart cold with horrors, the brain reeling, the legs aching. Next moment, all this was gone. Gone like a bad dream, never to be of any account. Defeated, outmaneuvered fool. As he saw you, he also saw them. I know how it was. You reeled back, dizzy and blinded, more hurt by them than he had ever been by bombs. The degradation of it, that this thing of earth and slime could stand upright and converse with the spirits before whom you, a spirit, could only cower. Perhaps you had hoped that the awe and strangeness of it would dash his joy. But that is the cursed thing. The gods are strange to mortal eyes, and yet they are not strange. He had no faintest conception till that very hour of how they would look, and even doubted their existence. But when he saw them, he knew that he had always known them and realized what part each one of them had played at many an hour in his life. He had supposed himself alone. So now that he could say to them one by one, not who are you, but so it was you the whole time. He saw not only them, he saw him. This animal, this thing begotten on a bed, could look on him. What is blinding, suffocating fire to you is now cool light to him. It is clarity itself, and wears the form of a man. You would like, if you could, to interpret the patient's prostration in the presence, his self-abhorrence and utter knowledge of his sins. Yes, Wormwood, a clearer knowledge than even yours, on the analogy of your own choking and paralyzing sensations when you encounter the deadly air that breathes from the heart of heaven. But it's all nonsense. Pains he may still have to encounter, but they embrace those pains. They would not barter them for any earthly pleasure. Sometimes I am almost in despair. All that sustains me is the conviction that our realism, our rejection, in the face of all temptations, of all silly nonsense and claptrap, must win in the end. Meanwhile, I have you to settle with. Most truly do I sign myself, your increasingly and ravenously affectionate uncle, Screwtape. No matter how many times I read letters, that still hits. The patient dies in an instant. Sees Wormwood as if a scab had fallen from his eyes. Besides Wormwood, he sees God, the lion and the lamb, who also wears the form of a man. He is able to look upon heaven, and while he feels the pain of his sins and transgressions, he would not trade that pain for any pleasure in the world. Meanwhile, Wormwood feels nothing but a burning, choking, paralyzing sensation
And while there is one more story at the very end of the letters, called Screwtape Proposes a Toast, we will never see Wormwood again. It is my theory, as well as the most common, that Screwtape ended up devouring Wormwood, as he was not given the patient's soul as a meal. He instead settled for Wormwood, the dainty morsel of which he grew fat on. The Screwtape Letters follows the patient from a boy, discusses his family, his mother, how prayer should work in that setting, moves on to his church life, eventually talking about love, his love interest. He's then drafted to war. We hear that it is only what men conceive as injury that actually injures them. Screwtape speaks of death, and then the patient does die. The Screwtape Letters are very serious in the sense that they deal with serious topics in each of the letters. But as I said at the start, the way that these serious topics are discussed is what makes the material so enrapturing. In what other book can you talk about division within the church from the narrative focus of a demon who turns into a centipede and then gets laughably upset? Personally, I think there is nothing like it. Nonetheless, that is all for this video. It is finally coming to an end. I do hope you enjoyed it. I don't believe in asking for likes or for subscriptions, but if you did find this valuable, do me a favor and try to teach something from this video or discuss something from this video to someone over the next couple of days. You don't gotta say where you learned it from. I believe that as a people and as a world, we need to do better at learning and teaching. So I would be ever grateful if you would do that for me. Thank you for watching.